Welcome to my March of the Machine draft guide. In this video, I'll be providing you with all of the information you need to find success in your March of the Machine drafts. I'll be discussing the set mechanics, the top commons, I'll provide archetype overviews, I'll discuss the combat tricks, traps to avoid, combos you can assemble, and more. Kicking things off with the set mechanics, they are Battle, Backup, Incubate, Convoke, double-faced cards, and multiverse legends. First up is Battle, a brand new mechanic and card type for Magic the Gathering. They'll look like this when you have them in your packs, but you're going to be reading them sideways because the card is oriented horizontally. The way that a battle works is essentially as a reverse planeswalker. You will play the battle into play, get whatever effect it has, and then you will have the option to attack it while your opponent has the option to block in order to protect it. If you are able to remove its last defense counter, so for example, Invasion of Zendikar comes in with 3 defense counters, and it will take damage normally. So if you hit it for 3, it'll lose 3 defense counters. If that last defense counter is removed, it will then be exiled, and then you can cast it as the transformed half. So you'll cast the Awakened Skyclave part of the card. And so that is going to be how battles work. They come in at uncommon and higher rarities, and they're going to be a key part of the set and how things work. Next is a much simpler mechanic, Backup. It essentially lets you put +1/+1 counters onto your creatures and give them temporary abilities. So with Golden Scale Aeronaut, you'll play it as a 2/3 flyer, and then you can either put a +1/+1 counter onto itself or onto another one of your creatures. If you do put that counter onto another creature, that creature will gain flying until end of turn, because that is the ability that follows Backup on Golden Scale Aeronaut. There are all sorts of abilities you can give to your creatures with Backup in this set. The next new mechanic is Incubate, which is a way to get a creature, but on a bit of a delay. So the way it works is you'll play your card that says Incubate on it. In the case of Merciless Repurposing, you'll exile a creature, and then it says Incubate 3, and then you put an Incubator token into play with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. It's not actually a creature yet, though, because you'll have to pay 2 mana to transform it into a 0/0, which is a creature, and because it has 3 +1/+1 counters on it, in this case, it'll essentially function as a 3/3. The next mechanic is Convoke. It's a returning mechanic, and it lets you tap your creatures to cast your spells. The creature is essentially tapping for colorless mana, or whatever color that creature is, to cast the spell. So if you have 4 creatures, including 2 red ones, you can cast Stoke the Flames by just tapping all of those creatures. You can pay some of the mana with your creatures, and it's really a flexible mechanic to cast your spells for cheaper. The next mechanic is double-faced cards. They are fairly straightforward. You play the front half of the card, and then when you meet the condition to transform it, oftentimes that is paying mana, you will flip it into the back half of the card, and then sometimes you'll get a benefit for transforming it, as in the case of Captive Weird. When it transforms into Completed Conjurer, you'll get to exile the top card of your library, and then play it until the end of your next turn. The final mechanic is more of a draft mechanic, because in every booster pack there is going to be one card that is a multiverse legend, and this is a special art card that represents a legendary creature from Magic's history that is thematically connected to the story, and you'll be able to draft these and play these even though they aren't technically in the set, because they are in boosters and you will be able to draft them. So keep that in mind. There are uncommons, rares, and mythics that are multiverse legends, and so they will be playing a role in the set. Moving on to the top commons, starting with white. At number 1 is Realmbreaker's Grasp, a very powerful removal spell, because not only does it stop the opponent from attacking or blocking with a particular creature, but it also stops that creature's activated abilities unless they're mana abilities, which is really nice upside to have on this sort of effect. At number 2 is Sunder the Gateway, a really powerful 2-drop because it can come in as a creature right away if you use its second ability, just incubate 2 and then transform that incubate token, but you also have the ability to get a potential 2-for-1 of sorts by destroying one of your opponent's non-token artifacts or enchantments, and then using that extra 2 mana later to flip the incubate token on your own. And this is going to be particularly relevant in killing your opponent's battle cards, which are enchantments. At number 3 is Attentive Skywarden, a flyer that is going to be really nice if you do have some Incubate synergy in your deck, because if you are able to get a free flip of an Incubator token, you've essentially generated 2 mana with your 3 mana flyer, which is just really, really good upside and can lead to some really snowbally games. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Preening Champion, a very powerful card because a 3-mana 2/2 flyer that comes in with a 1/1 would already be good, but it plays especially well with this set. The flyer is great at attacking battles that your opponent is trying to defend, and the extra 1/1 is very relevant for using Convoke abilities. At number 2 is Temporal Cleansing, a removal spell for blue that takes good advantage of Convoke and is able to remove problematic cards that your opponent has. Even though they can get them back later, it's still a 1-for-1 removal spell. And then at number 3 is Oculus Whelp, a nice flyer for attacking battles, and also is going to be able to draw you a card when it dies a good portion of the time because there are tons of double-faced cards in this set, and also the Incubate tokens will count as transformed permanents if you have flipped them, so that's something to note as well. Moving on to black, at number 1 is Deadly Derision, an incredibly powerful removal spell that's going to kill anything you want and then make a treasure token to ramp you or allow you to double spell later. And number 2 is Final Flourish, another great removal spell that you can use to kill something small or kill something bigger in the mid game. It's also super nice because if your opponent tries to kill one of your creatures, then you might just sacrifice that creature in response to kill one of their big creatures. So Final Flourish, a really nice removal spell. And then at number 3 is another removal spell, Vanquish the Weak, which is going to be able to destroy any mid-sized creature that your opponent has. It's worth noting that you don't want to have too much removal in your deck, so once you have some of these effects, then you're going to lower their priority on them a little bit, but there's going to be a lot of players fighting for the removal during the draft, so you'll still want to prioritize these cards. Next up is red. At number 1 is Volcanic Spite, which is absolutely fantastic. You can kill creatures, and notably you can also deal damage to battles if you do need to do those extra points of damage, and you can also filter cards from your hand if you have a dead land in the late game, or you need to dig for lands in the early game, anything like that. Volcanic Spite is absolutely fantastic. At number 2 is Thrashing Frontliner, a great 2-drop that is especially good at attacking down battles, which is very relevant because being able to flip those early in the game is going to be a huge tempo advantage. And then at number 3 is Rouse Reinforcements. Making 2 1/1s isn't always the best card, but in this set where Convoke is one of the main mechanics, it's really a powerful thing to be able to do because it just sets you up to do very powerful things very early in the game. Last up is green. Its best common is Cosmic Hunger, which is a fantastic removal spell in this set. Instant speed, punch effects for green are always nice, and the fact that this can also damage battles is fantastic. At number 2 is Overgrown Pest, a nice little 3-mana 2/2 that gives you some card advantage by drawing you a card with card selection when it comes into play, so just a really nice card to have access to. And then at number 3 is Portent Tracker, a great card to play on turn 2 because it will ramp you up and also be a source of unblockable damage when dealing with battles in the mid to late game. You're also able to put extra defense counters onto any battles that you are protecting, which is really nice if there is one that really would be bad for you for your opponent to flip. Moving on to the color rankings, black is at number 1. It just has fantastic removal, and all of its other commons are also just great. Red, white, and green are kind of in the mid tier. They're all very close. They all do very powerful things, and they all have great commons. And then blue lags a little bit behind, mostly because it just lacks really quality 2-drops in the way that the other colors have access to, which can slow it down a little bit. But overall, all of the colors are good, and this is more of a tiebreaker situation if you are making a close pick. Moving on to the archetype overviews and starting with red-white. It is an aggressive deck. It gains access to a very powerful battle, Invasion of Kylem, which buffs up 2 of your creatures when it comes into play and can even give them haste if you are in a late game situation. And if you are able to flip it, it is very hard to lose the game because you're going to make 2 3/2s that then buff themselves when they attack because you'll have other creature tokens attacking. It's overall just a fantastic card if you are able to flip it, and because you're an aggressive deck, you're much more likely to be able to do so. You'll also gain access to a card like Mirror Shield Hoplite, which is a nice 2-drop because you're going to be able to use backup abilities multiple times, and Fearless Scald is another great way to push damage because giving a creature double strike can lead to some scary amounts of damage, especially when combined with that +1/+1 counter that backup adds. Moving on to blue-black, it is a graveyard deck. It gains access to the powerful battle Invasion of Amonkhet, which lets you mill both players and then get some card advantage as well. It flips into the very powerful Lazotep Convert, which is an excellent payoff. Halo Forager is another great card for blue-black because it's a flyer that can be used to attack down battles, but also gives you the ability in the late game to cast instants or sorceries from either player's graveyard, and it doesn't care about the colors, so you can cast red instants or sorceries from your opponent's graveyard or things like that, so just a great card for the archetype. Render Inert is another card I wanted to mention because a blue-black deck is sometimes more defensive, which means it might not be as good at attacking down battles, but Render Inert doesn't really care about that because you can just use this to remove all of the counters from a particular battle. Next is green-white, which is a +1/+1 counters-based deck. It gains access to the battle Invasion of Moag, which is perfect for this strategy because it lets you put a +1/+1 counter on every creature you control. If you are able to flip it, which is much easier because you've just made all of your creatures bigger, it will flip into Bloomwielder Dryads, which lets you distribute even more +1/+1 counters. Botanical Brawler is another great card for this deck because it comes in as a 2/2, but continually grows as you put +1/+1 counters on your creatures. And then Kami of Whispered Hopes is also fantastic because it lets you put 2 +1/+1 counters onto your creatures instead of just one. This deck also plays really well with Backup because Backup does involve putting +1/+1 counters onto your creatures. Next is Red Blue, which is a deck that cares about Convoke. Joyful Storm Sculptor is the perfect card for this deck because you'll play it and immediately get 2 1/1s, which gives you 3 creatures to use for Convoke, and then whenever you do cast a spell with Convoke, you'll be able to deal damage to your opponents and the battles they are protecting. Astral Wingspan is another great card for this deck because if you are able to Convoke it out, you're going to have a massive flyer that is great for attacking down battles, and it'll even replace itself. Finally, Shivan Branch Burner is another great card for this deck because if you Convoke this out for a bit cheaper, you're getting a massive flyer with haste that is able to do the attacking and blocking that you need, particularly for getting battles off of the battlefield. Moving on to Green-Black, this is a deck that cares about going big with Incubate tokens and has some of the biggest Incubate numbers in the set. Elvish Vatkeeper is perfect as a 3-mana 3/3, that makes an Incubate token itself, and also lets you transform Incubator tokens and double the number of +1/+1 counters on them, which can get truly scary if you combine it with a card, for example, like Tangled Skyline, which says Incubate 5 on it. So if you use the Elvish Vatkeeper with that, you'll be getting a 10/10, and that's just a really powerful thing to be able to do. And Tangled Skyline gives all your Phyrexians reach, and the flipped Incubate tokens are Phyrexians. Finally, Gift of Completion is another great card, 2 mana for Incubate 3, and whenever a Phyrexian you control dies, you Surveil 1, so just a great card for your Incubate deck. Next is White-Blue, which is a deck that cares about Knights. Marshal of Zhalfir gives all of your other Knights +1/+1 and can tap down problematic creatures. Zhalfir and Lancer cares if you have another Knight enter the battlefield under your control, as it'll become a 4/4 Vigilance for just 3 mana if that is the case. And then Xeric's Strobe Knight is a nice little flyer that you can then activate to make even more Knights if you're able to chain 2 spells together in one turn. So just a really nice, cohesive, aggressive deck that cares about the Knight creature type. The next archetype is Red-Green, which cares about battles. It gains access to the uncommon Invasion of Argamon, which is really nice as a cheap battle that can let you fuel your battle synergies early by just being able to come down so that you can attack it. When you do flip it, it becomes Truga Cliffcharger, which lets you fetch another battle from your deck and continue fueling your synergies. Rampaging Geoderm is the perfect card for this deck because it comes down on turn 4 with haste and trample, so it can be a nice attacker, and when you are attacking, you can give your creatures permanent +1/+1 counters if you are attacking battles, which is just what you want in this deck. Scrappy Bruiser is another nice card for this deck because it can give your creatures temporarily +2/+0 and trample, and you will have to return that creature to your hand at the end of combat, but you should have been able to push through and either finish off a battle or deal significant damage to your opponent in the process. Another cool synergy with Scrappy Bruiser is that if you are using a card like Truga Cliffcharger as the thing you're targeting with Scrappy Bruiser, you can return that Cliffcharger to your hand and then replay it on its battle side. So if you have some really powerful battle cards, you can re-trigger their effect multiple times and continually fuel your synergies that way. Next up is White-Black, which is an archetype that cares about Phyrexians and incubating. It gains access to the powerful battle Invasion of New Capenna, which can let you sacrifice one of your artifacts or creatures to exile an artifact or creature your opponent controls, which is notable because you can sacrifice one of your Incubate tokens to kill a problematic permanent. When you do flip it, it becomes the Holy Frazzle Cannon, which is great in this archetype that has tons of Phyrexians in it, because if you equip it to a Phyrexian, when it attacks, you'll put a counter onto the Phyrexian attacking and all of your other Phyrexians, so just a really powerful effect to have access to. You'll also be able to play Sculpted Perfection, which gives all of your Phyrexians +1/+1 and also lets you incubate. And then Norn's Inquisitor is also really nice because whenever you do flip an incubate token, it'll get an extra +1/+1 counter. Moving on to Green-Blue, this is an archetype that cares about transformation. You'll gain access to the powerful uncommon Invasion of Pyrulia, which is going to come down as a 2-drop, let you scry to filter your draws, and then you can reveal the top card of your library and draw it. So it's going to replace itself and also set you up in the early turns, and then when you do flip it, you'll get a Gargantuan Slabhorn, which is just a nice 4/4 creature that's hard to deal with because of Ward, and also protects your other transformed permanents and gives them trample. You'll also be able to play Mutagen Connoisseur, which is really nice if you are playing a lot of transform cards and double-faced cards, because it'll be a flying creature with vigilance that is also getting a lot of buffs. You'll also be looking for Omen Hawker because its ability to get a colorless mana and a blue mana that can only be used for activated abilities is really nice for a lot of the double-faced cards that involve paying mana in order to transform them. So this is the sort of deck that can really use that ability well, as a 1 mana card that taps for 2 mana is just incredibly powerful if you are able to find a use for that mana. The final archetype is red-black, which is a sacrifice deck. Stormclaw Rager is a fantastic card because you'll be able to sacrifice your creatures or artifacts, presumably for value, because there are a lot of artifacts and creatures that give you some benefit when they die. You'll be able to grow your Stormclaw Rager and also draw cards, which is really powerful. Completed Huntmaster is another great card for this deck because you'll be able to turn your small creatures or your useless artifacts or your treasures into incubate tokens, which are quite sizable. And then finally, Furnace Reigns is a great card for this deck because you can take control of one of your opponent's creatures, hit them with it, and then sacrifice it to one of your effects, turning Furnace Reigns into an incredibly powerful removal spell. Moving on to the combat tricks. These are all of the combat tricks available at common in the set, so these are the ones that are going to come up the most often and the ones you'll want to be aware of because you don't want to get wrecked by them. White has access to Aerial Boost, notable because it can be cast for essentially 0 mana if they have 2 creatures and use the Convoke ability. It also has access to Angelic Intervention, which is really powerful because being able to gain protection from a color is just going to let them attack past your blockers in some number of cases. And then Inspired Charge is the sort of card you want to be aware of because if your opponent makes an all-out attack, Inspired Charge should just come to your mind. Moving on to blue, it gains access to Zalfarin Shapecraft, which is also very powerful. Turning a creature into a 4/3 is just really nice, especially because some number of creatures are going to have +1/+1 counters on them, as is the case with the Incubate tokens that you've flipped into Phyrexians, and those creatures will become even bigger because it'll still have the +1/+1 counters. Saiba Cryptomancer is also really nice because it'll give a creature +1/+1 and hexproof, and then it'll leave a 0/1 behind, which can be used for Convoke. Black gains access to Bladed Battlefan, which is just a card to be aware of because it'll give a creature indestructible until end of turn. Red has access to Mirren Banespitter, which is +2/+0, Coming in Hot, which is +1/+0 and First Strike, and Burning Sun's Fury, which is +2/+0 to 2 separate creatures, and also has that Convoke ability, so it can potentially be cast for what looks like a 0 mana. Green has access to Arachnoid Adaptation, which is very powerful as a +2/+2 for just 1 mana that even untaps the creature and gives it reach, so be careful of that. And then Vengeant Earth is a final combat trick that turns a creature or land into a 4/4, so you might be aware of that even if your opponent has no creatures in play. Moving on to the traps section, first up is Seed of Hope, a card that just doesn't really do enough to merit its inclusion. You're very unlikely to miss and hit 2 instants or sorceries when you play this, which means you're not going to be just losing the game on the spot by just whiffing, which is sometimes the risk with this sort of card, but generally you want to be playing creatures and cards that affect the board in the early turns so that you can attack battles, defend battles, and set up for Convoke. And Seed of Hope just doesn't do any of those things. It just digs you a little bit farther into your deck, and so it's just not the sort of card that you're going to want to be playing, and especially not the sort of card you'd ever want to prioritize. Next is Furnace Gremlin, a card that can be played, but should not really be prioritized because it's just weaker than it looks. It has a lot of text on it, it's got a lot of abilities, it's an uncommon, but overall it's kind of small and requires a lot of investment of mana to actually grow it, and so it's just not the sort of card that you're going to be super interested in, other than maybe in a sacrifice deck where you can sacrifice this card, get the Incubate token, and then sacrifice that token to something else, but overall not the sort of card that you're going to be wanting to prioritize in most decks. And then finally, Copper Host Crusher is certainly a playable card in a ramp strategy, but a lot of the time if you're just trying to put this into a green deck in general, it's not going to be playable because you're not going to have the tools to get up to 8 mana. So that's just something to keep in mind with Copper Host Crusher and for Furnace Gremlin and even Seed of Hope, is that if you have a specific plan for using these cards, they can be played, but oftentimes they're just going to be bad if you just put them in a generic deck. Next are some combos you can assemble. First is a combo between Protocol Knight and Cut Short. Cut Short is a removal spell that kills tapped creatures. Protocol Knight taps creatures temporarily, and so if you combine the two, you can tap a creature you care about and then kill it with Cut Short, which is really powerful, turning your situational removal spell into a much more powerful one. Next is a combo between Redcap Heel Slasher and Mirrodin Avenged. Mirrodin Avenged lets you kill a creature that was dealt damage this turn, and Redcap Heel Slasher has First Strike and can give your other creatures First Strike as well temporarily. So if you are attacking your opponent with First Strike creatures, you can wait until after the First Strike damage has been dealt, and then use Mirrodin Avenged to kill your opponent's creature before their creature has its chance to deal regular damage, which is quite nice. The next combo is between Furtive Analyst and Ichor Drinker. So if you use the Analyst to draw a card and then discard a card, you can discard the Ichor Drinker and then use its ability from the graveyard to get some extra value out of your cards without having to worry about playing the Drinker, having it die, and things like that. The final combo is between Serpent Blade Assailant and Scroll Shift. Serpent Blade Assailant has backup, which is usually something you can only use on your turn at sorcery speed to give one of your creatures Death Touch and an extra counter. Scroll Shift, however, lets you exile a creature and then bring it back into play at instant speed, all while replacing itself by drawing you a card, which means that you can give your creatures Death Touch when your opponent doesn't expect it, such as in the middle of combat when you're blocking or when you're attacking. You can also use Scroll Shift with a bunch of other backup abilities to give them things like First Strike if you're using it with a Red Cap Heal Slasher, or just whatever ability you have on your backup creatures, so that's just a cool combo to be aware of. Moving on to the mana fixing, first up is in the land slot, it is the gain lands. They come into play tapped, they gain you a life, and then they can tap for one of two colors. So Tranquil Cove is an example, and there is one for every 2 color pair in the set. Next is Blighted Burgeoning, which is in green, and it lets you incubate when it comes into play, and then lets your land tap for a mana of any color in addition to its color when you do tap it for mana, which is nice. Fertilid's Favor is a little bit more expensive, but it can also be used somewhat as a combat trick. I didn't quite put it in the combat trick section. It kind of went into this section, but overall it kind of is a mix of both because it gets you a basic land card, which can be of a splash color or something like that, and it puts 2+1/+1 counters onto one of your artifacts or creatures. So that's just something to keep in mind as a potential source of fixing and kind of combat trick all in one card. And then at colorless, you get Urn of Godfire, which is 1 mana, and then you can pay 2 mana to kind of filter your mana. So you are paying a bit of a tax when you do that, but it can help you get the colors you need in a pinch. And then in the late game, you can sacrifice it to kill a creature or enchantment. And then finally, Skittering Surveyor is a fantastic source of fixing because for 3 mana, you get a creature, which you can use for convoke abilities, for sacrificing, just for attacking or blocking, things like that. But it also gets you a basic land, which lets you get your splash color or just helps you continue hit your land drop. So Skittering Surveyor is a great source of mana fixing. Moving on to some final tips. The first one is that battles and convoke make creatures and a good mana curve important for all decks. Now, it's pretty clear that if you're playing battles in your deck, you're going to often want to be an aggressive deck that can attack those battles and flip them to get their powerful transformed selves. But it's also important to have creatures if you aren't an aggressive deck, because you'll need to be able to protect and block so that your opponents can't flip those battles super easily. In some formats, you could rely on early removal spells or things like just taking damage and then catching up later. But in this format, you're really going to want to prevent your opponent from being able to leverage those battle cards, or you'll want to leverage them yourselves, so you'll want those early creatures. Convoke also makes it so that a lot of the decks that are going to rely on casting instants and sorceries or more powerful top-end cards are going to really benefit from having early creatures as well, because those creatures and powerful spells can be cast for cheaper if you have creatures in play to use Convoke for them. The final tip I have is that double-faced cards give you extra information when drafting in paper. Use it wisely. That information comes in the form of the fact that those cards do not have a back side to them, so when your opponent drafts a double-faced card, you're going to know that they've drafted that double-faced card, and then you can use that to inform your draft decisions. If you know that the person next to you has opened a bomb rare mythic double-faced battle and they've taken it, you're not going to want to draft that color because you're pretty confident that they're just going to be taking every card of that color that they can. It gives you a lot of extra knowledge in the draft that you normally wouldn't have, and so that can be used to inform your decisions, and you definitely should have it inform your decisions. That is going to do it for this draft guide. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to hit that like button, subscribe for more videos, and comment if you have any questions or feedback. And to let me know you made it all the way till the end of the video, leave hashtag draftingmachine in the comment section down below. I hope you enjoyed this. Good luck in your drafts, and I'll talk to you next time.